Money.
How's everybody doing? Nina's glad she's done her part. Welcome to the second part of the morning and panel number 2. And I'm really excited to introduce this panel. I think that one of the things that makes AHA as an organization strong is the diversity in our organizations and collections and how we are able to face the challenges that we're presented with in our unique collections. Panel number 2 is going to be concentrating on principles and practices. Where do you start when addressing a neglected or overlooked collection? How do you create or rethink standards for access and preservation to reflect input from the community and its specific needs? By thoughtful stewarding of the establishment, by thoughtfully stewarding the establishment of principles and best practices, archivists are giving collections new life. In this panel, we will hear from these 3 lovely archivists who have been challenged to create institutional policy to preserve and provide access while respecting the law, adding community input and Indigenous knowledge and protocols to their records. The first speaker is Georgina from Iolani Schools. Georgina is currently archivist at Iolani School Archives. Her previous work experience includes reference librarian at Hawaiʻi Pacific University and collections technician at Shangri-La, Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. She's also a past board member of AHA, and she's earned a graduate certificate in museum studies and a Master of Library and Information Sciences with a departmental certificate in archives and special collections from the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa. She holds a digital archive specialist through the Society of American Archivists, and in addition is a proud wife and mother of 2. The next speaker will be Ellen-Rae Cachola, who's the evening supervisor and archives manager at the University of Hawaiʻi School of Law Library. Ellen-Rae is the evening supervisor at the Law Library and a lecturer at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, Department of Ethnic Studies. Ellen-Rae received her PhD in Information Studies, specializing in archival studies from the University of California at Los Angeles. She served as the project manager of the Archival Education Research Institute from 2010 to 2014, which has been dedicated to creating the next generation of archival doctorates, particularly from underrepresented communities within the library and archival fields. And last but not least, Brooks Hatterley is the university archivist right here at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. And he also participated as a host yesterday in our Holo Holo Day, so thank you. And it was a really special visit. If you didn't get a chance, give him a call. Come by, see his collection. Brooks came to Paradise just a couple of years ago from the BYU Idaho Library, where he worked for 20 years. Prior to that, he worked as an information scientist in Ohio. He's traveled extensively and is very concerned about the preservation of culture, language, and history. And we're going to start off with Georgina.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So I have to confess that in recent days, this presentation has seemed less and less a good idea. Because I feel like I'm about to show you my x-rays and I'm feeling a little overexposed here. So be gentle. So Iolani was born as a result of King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma requesting the establishment of a mission of the Church of England in the islands. It was known as St. Albans College in the early years, and jurisdiction of the school remained with the church through the church's various changes until the school's incorporation in 1942. The archival program was started in the late 1970s by librarians using the Dewey decimal system. So as you know, this system violates the respect for the original order, and it risks the aggregate, which gives context, authenticity, and uniqueness. In addition, much was dictated by inadequate storage spaces and improper environmental conditions. So first it was a small room within the library, and then in the 1990s, part-time archivists came on staff to work in the collection. Currently, I am the loan arranger. I was recently made full-time, and periodically we had an archives assistant, but unfortunately, a loss for me, which I fought for, was that once the archivist position went full-time, they discontinued the archives assistant position. And that actually resulted in a loss of a quarter time of archival work because we had pushed the archivist position to 3/4 time, and then that assistant position was at half-time. So in all of my pushing and rah-rah for archives, I feel that was a big loss. Our collections are made up of still images, moving images, multimedia items, textiles, publications, and collections about key historical figures in the school. So we function both as an academic archive and as a corporate archive. On the academic side, we get students from the school who come in. We also get undergraduate students from the various universities and graduate students. We get the school faculty and staff and authors, journalists, members of the public, both internationally and locally. And they're researching school history or genealogy, topography, and a lot of other things. They all have their own focus, and it's always really fun to interact with them. So we also function in the corporate sense, in that the archivist is the source and conducting the research for members of upper administration, such as the head of school and the board of governors. So the timeline on these items is like, when do you want it? Well, I wanted it yesterday. All right, so as soon as possible, and that's one of my things is, hey guys, I'm not a drive-through, but that's a hard battle to win there. Our institutional advancement office, which is very, very active, and our communications office, which is also very active. We're very, very heavy users along with the head of school. And I also have to do various interviews for different types of media. So an example of an actual request that I had was to detail the entire history of the boarding program from 1863 to 1960, which is 97 years, and my deadline was 1 week. And at that time, I was still part-time. So as I mentioned, part-time archivists, half-time archivists began working in the collection in the 1990s, and they really just had to do the best that they could with the little bit of time that they had every day. And so these predecessors tried to establish authority files, and they had handwritten accessions with really only a couple of fields. They had created some partial inventories, and so I can be grateful for that. But really the part-time nature of the work meant that the focus was pressure to make good on all of these requests, and a lot of community relations and showing up with displays for things like reunions or other kind of social aspects within the school rather than stewardship of the actual collections. And in addition, there were several building moves of the collection, and so this took up a ton of their time when you're talking about people who are only there a few hours a day. So really, the collection was lacking in standards and lacking in manuals. There was no way to search the collection. There wasn't really a way to know what was where, and overall consistency was really lacking. So some of the specific issues that this brought about were accession records lacked description, provenance was unclear, there was unsurveyed or unaccessioned holdings, or if they were accessioned, they're on process. Basically, everything is in process, and there's just a real lack of information. And I think because the archivist was there for such a little part of the day, all of this is the direct result of the anonymous drop-offs, the piecemeal drop-offs. Literally one or two things will get dropped off with no trace, and that's because they're dropped off at the main office or in the library or somewhere when the archivist is not even on duty. And so all of this made the process of meeting requests extremely confusing and very inefficient. And so it was starting from ground zero at the beginning of every request, and it took a ton of time to do anything. And it was also very confusing when you have a system like that to know where to incorporate possible new accessions. And so, you know, just things like I found a note on a box that says what was in this box, and you know, that's not helpful when I'm trying to meet requirements. So my goals really were based on the need for efficiency, both for the users and for myself in meeting these requests. And I wanted to gain control over our holdings. I wanted to enrich the data that was available and get to know what creator functional relationships were, and establish record groups and improve reference services. And I wanted to establish a K-12 program because, at least in my history, it's very rare to have an archivist within a K-12 environment, and I think it's really important to expose these children as early as possible to these primary source records. It's just a very unique opportunity for them, is my feeling. And I also wanted to procure a CMS, but I knew that I wouldn't even be able to enter items into a CMS without a ton of work happening. So, armed with my motivation, I don't remember where I got this from, but I loved it the moment I saw it. And I felt that something had to be done, and that the collection was small enough to make a change now for a better future. And so, that do not undo mentality that my predecessors had, I felt that it had to be reached back to the records creators, past those first librarians who used and assigned the Dewey Decimal System. And so I slowly began informally surveying the collection, just making observations and just watching everything around me. I examined the different functionality of everything and observed my user needs. I was really learning from my community during this time. And I also assessed the institutional needs, meaning all of the admin that came to me, the board of governors, and you know, what are the various needs that they have, and is anything reoccurring. And I also wanted to consider future needs and use. One of the things I did was change the accession sheet and add more fields, and just in an effort to capture more information, and really as much information as I could. So then I looked to see what was actually in the boxes, because one of the things that I found was the notations on the boxes were not always correct. And so I found separated collections and collections that were getting damaged because of the way that they were housed. And so based on desired use, I kind of identified a few areas to create finding aids for, and created the digital instance and posted to our website. And I used my new knowledge of the collection to identify areas of potential support for courses, such as history of the modern world, war in the 20th century, and our social studies courses for the younger kids. So part of my big push is anytime a student or a group of students comes into the class, because I'm in a K-12, I'm telling them about our collections, but I feel it's my duty to tell them about world collections as well, and to perhaps spark that interest in history. So I provided a session during the in-house professional development day for teachers that starts every year, and I added that information to our LibGuides and emailed all the teachers to make sure that that information was both known and more accessible to them, so that they literally all they had to do was click on a link. So during that time, I also called the various offices, and I tried to learn the hierarchical structures, the relationships of these creators, and I I tried to be very diligent in leaving a trail of documentation about what I was doing so that theoretically anything that I did could be stepped backwards and undone in the future if desired. So I was very happy to have some faculty members who were takers. They were interested in the work that was going on. And so I was able to begin the education program. So what you see here are images from a World War I lesson for History of the Modern World grade 9 students. And I just ran this program again for the second year this past week. And it was, again, a really positive experience. So during this lesson, students rotate through a variety of stations. So one of them is a bank of sketches and narrative observations from a faculty member who was deployed as part of the American Expeditionary Forces. And he is a beloved figure in the history of the school who is always brought up to students. He was a coach as well, and so every generation of students is being told about this figure. And so I wanted a connection, a different kind of connection with this man, and I feel that this is the way to go about it. And so there's another station that has pictures of students and buildings and grounds and faculty. So it's all about the school in that era. And there's also a history that has a list of faculty and students who are fighting in the war. And so that, again, is another connection for our students with this event in history. There's also a scrapbook created by a faculty member from 1917 to 1918, and it details both in narrative and photographs the story of how he took a group of young students to a neighbor island to work on plantations as part of the home initiative of the U.S. Boys Working Reserve. And so students can see people their own age doing this hard labor and why they're doing this. So I don't know if you can see the television monitor in the back. So the National Archives came out with a Remembering World War I app a couple of years ago. And so I was able to get this television monitor up, and I connect to that app when I'm doing this. And we also had the app pushed to their individual iPads, and they can interact there or on my screen or individually. So for the first time ever, an Excel sheet gave me joy. Because I felt I had got to a point where I had intellectually fleshed out record groups. And so they're often provenance information, but decisions had to be made. So there's a group of administrative memos, and we're talking years and years, and I could probably go back and figure out who developed these, but that's too taxing on my time. So instead I'm creating notes, C as of, dates, just include the documentation. So something like, see also administrative memos prior to will be in the upcoming records. So, and I also was not just making changes for the sake of making changes. Certain things, there was not enough information to make those changes. So I tried to be really cognizant of ease of access, but also of not obscuring information further. So certain things like the subject photograph collection had to, it was a photograph collection, and I called it the subject photograph collection to indicate its function and also to indicate there are other collections. And then I was inordinately excited to get labels, and as always, I was trying to advocate, because I'm constantly repeating myself, and I'm in a whole environment, and nobody else is an archivist, and so it's really important. And this presentation, the first iteration, it was for a supervisor to make my case and my needs statements, and fortunately I found a supporter in the Dean of Indigenous Studies, and I'm happy to report we've got our Leadership Associate instance up, and I will start to populate our archive space. And so I am very slowly getting there by making decisions based on best practice and institutional need.
Okay, I think so. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. This is such a pleasure to be here. It's such a beautiful place to be. Thank you so much for AHA always bringing us together. It's such a great pleasure to be with all of you and to learn what's going on in all of your archives. My name is Ellen-Rae Cachola. I am the Evening Supervisor and Archives Manager at the University of Hawaiʻi School of Law Library. And so this is the title of my presentation, to explore different standards of archival access. And it's a process, a research topic that I had back last year because of different discussions that I had with a fellow librarian about the style that I make archives accessible and how it was a little bit different from her expectations of how things should be accessed from the librarian side. So I had to really think about what I was doing as an archivist and really try to back up the style that I try to make archives accessible, going through these different standards of access, because I am working in a law library, it's an academic law library. And so I had to understand access to law in the legal field. But I also realized we're in Hawaii and Indigenous communities and serving Indigenous students as well as international students. So I had to look up different archival services that serve Indigenous communities as well as international peoples. And so after going through all of these different types of collections or standards, I tried to test some archival access procedures and policies that I created. And it was exhibited, or the process led to an exhibit that I did with the Pacific Island Legal Institute, which is a program that the law school sets up every couple of years to provide judicial seminars to different judges from Oceania islands, such as in Federated States of Micronesia, American Samoa, and in Hawaii. And so just to give the background of the institution that I serve, it was created by William S. Richardson, who is a Hawaiian, Chinese, and Caucasian man. And he set up the school, started advocating for the school since 1966, and it was opened in 1973. And the school's purpose was to create opportunities for local Indigenous children from Hawaii to have access to legal education. The school was opened during the time of the Hawaiian Renaissance, 1960s, 1970s. And he believed that it was important for people of Hawaii to have access to legal education so that they could be eventually the government leaders of the place that we are now living in. Prior to this, a lot of government officials came from the United States, and they didn't have a lot of the cultural knowledge or the historical knowledge of the place. So he was passionate about creating the school so that we could have a state that is with people that are legally trained here in Hawaii. But also he was interested in engaging in legal research and education in the broader Pacific region. And so he was active in different conferences with judges from across Oceania, participating in the South Pacific Judicial Conferences, which was the topic of the exhibit that I eventually did. So some of the things that I had to think through when I was engaging in the discussion in the law library about my style of access, I had to think about the differences and the similarities between archives and libraries and their principles of accessibility. The differences is that archives have a lot of reaccessions, more or less disordered information from different sources that are outside of the library. And usually when we're looking at books and DVDs, libraries usually acquire them in some form of disparate item that has an ISBN or it's packaging. And when archives, when we receive our items, because they're in disordered conditions, they are usually we don't really know what their status is. It takes us some time to really understand where they came from, how do we understand them, how do we translate what these items are for some legibility to our users. And usually library books and library items are generally more or less, you can read the book jacket, you can read the back, you can read the summaries, and then you can create catalog records, and they're quickly processed for shelving and accessibility. And so for archives, there is a balance between preservation and access that we must consider, which takes us some time before things are accessible. But for libraries, they have a principle of intellectual freedom and the freedom to read, and that the librarian cannot be standing in the way of access, that they should make sure that there's no censorship. But because archivists have this responsibility of going through all this information, the responsibility of preservation and access, it takes us some time, and sometimes we have to create restrictions on access, which can sometimes be seen from the intellectual freedom and freedom to read perspective as like a blockage to access. And so this is the kind of debate that I had, and I had to really explain and educate my fellow colleague about the specificity of archives and the way that we do things. In any case, this was how I tried to kind of think through what is it that I should be doing as a archives person in the law library. So the first principle that I had to look up was the free access to law principle, Montreal Declaration of Free Access to Law. And a lot of it has to do with promoting just the public accessibility of records, just like what Adam Jansen had discussed, that these are court documents, these are federal government records, these are state records, and they should be available for everyone. And it makes sense because we're all affected by these documents and what they do. And that these institutions, like the law library, should have the right to allow other people to access them so that they can make more information about it, research to help in the court cases, in other types of government research. But I also work in the academic environment where we're fostering education on the law and histories of the law. So the question that I had about this Montreal Declaration is, when we talk about the rule of law, which rule of law are we discussing? In the research that I was doing to do this exhibit for the Pacific Island Legal Institute, I discovered the different layers of jurisdiction that exist in the Pacific. From, if we look at this map here, we have Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia, and how those distinctions were imported from French explorer named Jules de Aurille, and how that was a specific understanding of the Pacific. And then we have also Spanish, British, German, Japan, and the United States and the UN, and also shaping laws of the Pacific Islands. And then I also learned that Indigenous Pacific Islanders have their own ways of traditional law and customary law that's usually conveyed orally through family genealogy type of stuff, as we heard earlier. And so these are the kinds of things I have to think about in terms of what I mean by access to law, which law, in what medium. So I started to look at other archival repositories that try to provide access policies related to Indigenous materials. And I found the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Archival Service Policy, which comes from Australia. And it says that the network of Australian archivists or archives contains an unparalleled storehouse of recorded knowledge relating to items such as Aboriginal customs, traditions, genealogies, and the experience of European invasion and the imposition of foreign laws and administrative systems. And much of this information exists in written form amongst archival records that has been lost to the oral tradition and memory of Aboriginal people, or was deliberately kept from them. And so because of this movement with this archival policy, they really found that archives and archivists have the opportunity and a responsibility to assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to make use of archival holdings, and that archives staff people should make sure to be emotionally aware of the affect of these archives as they make them accessible, and to engage them into facilitating access because they're underrepresented in their accessibility to these records for various reasons. Another policy that I looked at regarding how archives can make materials accessible to underrepresented groups. I found the protocols for Native American archival materials. And this policy was useful in giving concrete examples that people can do, consult with and concur with tribal communities in decisions and policies, recognize that there's special treatment for specific items, rethink public accessibility for certain items, the role of cultural property rights and intellectual rights, and just on and on and on different items is listed here. So after looking through all of that, I realized that there is this other aspect of access, that we do want to use our traditional archive practice, which has a lot to do with indexing and the technology, the databases and all that, but I also had to explore exhibits as another way to engage the humanity aspect of archival access, as I've learned from the ATSILA and the essay, the archival protocols of the Native Americans. So this is the case study that I did in terms of trying to organize an exhibit implementing these other access policies into the existing access policy. And so one of the things that the first Archivist Circle suggested was reaching out to other Indigenous people whose histories and are represented in your archive. And so because the law school does have a strong Native Hawaiian law program, and a Pacific Island law program, I reached out to them and suggested, hey, we have this collection that's called the Pacific Island Committee Archive, and it was the US Ninth Circuit Court documents about their participation in the South Pacific Judicial Conferences and the administration of law in US territories in the Pacific. And so she said, sure, you can have an exhibit for the welcome reception for the Pacific Island Legal Institute. Judges from Palau, Yap, Chuuk, Osprey, Pohnpei, Marshall Islands, and American Samoa will be coming for judicial seminars. And so I said, okay, so we organized an exhibit featuring documents of the South Pacific Judicial Conference booklets from 1972 to 2003. And in those booklets, you can see a lot of the debates between the colonial jurisdiction laws with the Indigenous judges' perspectives about the laws, which was I tried to do excerpts of that there. And then we also had a second exhibit featuring just pre-colonial or pre-Western colonial jurisdiction and post-colonial, I guess, or post-colonial collaborations in the Pacific, utilizing some archival papers from the John Van Dyke collection and the Samuel P. King collection. And the last thing that we did for the exhibit was try to capture the oral stories of these judges, knowing that some of the things that I learned in the process is that a lot of the Indigenous customary law of the peoples in Federated States of Micronesia, a lot of it is oral, and they don't have it written down, much like how we have it in our Western modern law. It's all written down, it's very indexed and codified and such. But the Indigenous peoples in those islands don't have it in that way. So we thought about what are the ways in which we can facilitate a conversation around those types of issues. And so we had a group conversation facilitated by Professor Andrade and the Ulu'u scholars, which are students from the islands of American Samoa, Chuuk, and Pohnpei, to engage in conversations with the judges that come from those islands. And they were able to have a first-hand conversation about things like native title, family law, immigration law in their islands. And then what we did was we recorded that conversation so that that oral history would be something that we can add to the digital archive in our collection. So my findings is that there's an important history in the law school in terms of showing how you have Indigenous peoples co-creating public records about their modern places that they live. and that this knowledge is important because it exposes Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to different approaches in government administration and law. Of course, we try to still maintain some of the principles of accessibility regarding the sensitivity of certain information, but physical access is always available to everyone who comes to the archive and engage face-to-face. And I think the most important thing is building partnerships with faculty members who specialize in these issues and students to participate, and how it can be usefully presented was something that I learned a lot. Thank you.